Good day. Today is Monday, 6th April 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this program you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, in my program yesterday, I discussed at great length the operation that the United States conducted inside Iran, apparently or purportedly to rescue a US Air Force navigator, the navigator of a shot down F-15 fighter jet, and the strange aspects of this operation, at least strange to my inexpert eyes, the fact that C-130 Hercules aircraft were deployed deep inside Iran in a rescue operation, the inconsistencies in some of the explanations as to what happened, the fact that it appeared that an airstrip had been used, otherwise it was difficult to understand how the C-130s could have been operational, how they could have landed, and the fact that there did seem to be evidence that these C-130s, these two C-130 aircraft had been destroyed and that other US military aircraft had been damaged. Now, in the hours after I made that program, in some cases before the program itself was published, this is an inevitable price one has to pay if one makes programs in the way that I do. But anyway, over the next couple of hours, more information began to come to light. Firstly, the Iranians provided photographic proof that two C-130 Hercules had indeed been destroyed in an airstrip in Iran. The information about the whereabouts of this operation were inconsistent with the information that I provided in my program yesterday. Instead of the operation taking place in southwest Iran, it appears to have taken place very close to the relatively close to the Iranian cities of Natanz and Isfahan, where it is known that there are substantial nuclear facilities, Iranian nuclear facilities, and close to an area where, allegedly, deep inside a tunnel, Iran supposedly stores its stockpile of enriched uranium. And, well, I received a cascade of comments from all sorts of people saying that the operation, as it was being described by the United States, made no sense, that, in fact, it did not look like an operation to rescue a navigator of a shot-down aircraft, but, well, there was speculation that something altogether more ambitious had been planned, that the operation had gone wrong in some way. The speculation centered on some kind of attempt to seize the enriched uranium stockpile in the tunnel in Isfahan. It was suggested that this was the first, what we saw was the first moves of some very ambitious operation of that kind, and that the operation was unsuccessful, and that the United States, that the Trump administration, that the president himself are covering for the failure of this operation by presenting it as a rescue attempt of this single navigator. Now, I've received some of these comments in private. There's also been considerable commentary to this effect on social media as well. So Simplicius the Thinker, Armchair Warlord, all of these people who write about these topics, often with great knowledge, have been lending weight to the theory that this was an operation to conduct some kind of special operation deep inside Iran, perhaps related to the seizure of the enriched uranium facilities. And, well, I would say that alongside all of this public commentary, I have also received an email from someone who I'm absolutely not going to identify, but who does indeed know a very great deal indeed about operations of this sort. And this person says that the way the rescue mission for the navigator has been described makes little sense based on his own experience, that it would be far more likely that a rescue mission would indeed be conducted by helicopter, long-range helicopter, and that there would be ways of doing this. The use of C-130 aircraft makes little sense in this context. And though this person, who, as I said, I consider authoritative, is not speculating about the nature of the mission, well, he clearly does have doubts. Now, I am not in a position to answer the questions or to say exactly what took place. What I am going to say about this whole affair is that the United States, at the very least, the US government, the administration, the Pentagon, are being, as we say in Britain, economical with the truth. Something did happen, and it was more complex than the US would have us all believe. Now, I say all of this, there are ways of reconciling the official American story with the information that we're now getting. I've seen one comment on social media which says that what happened was that the navigator who was shot down, the area where he was shot down was basically beyond reach of conventional rotorcraft. That meant that some kind of base area had to be captured by the United States deep inside Iran. This was the agricultural airstrip that is now universally acknowledged to have been the airstrip that was used and where these two C-130s were located, that the C-130s came with small helicopters, were carrying small helicopters, which would then have been used in the rescue, that there is something about the airstrip that made it impossible for the United States to airlift for the C-130s to take off from it, that they were therefore destroyed on the ground, and that the team, the rescue team, roughly 100 men, plus perhaps the pilots of the C-130s and other technicians, they had to be evacuated by air using smaller aircraft. And there's been various discussions about the types of aircraft used. Some say they were Airbus C295s, I believe. Others say they were a different type of aircraft. There's film which has been published of what looks like some kind of transport aircraft, smaller transport aircraft, operating very close to the ground inside Iran. Anyway, I am not going to discuss all of that. So that is one theory. There is another theory, which is by Larry Johnson, and you can read about it on Sonar 21. And this theory, this discussion of this affair by Larry Johnson, makes a unique point, which is that the navigator was, by his rank, a rather senior military officer with, I believe, the rank of lieutenant colonel, significantly more senior than that of what one would expect of a navigator on an F-15E. That it was probably the senior rank of this officer, and this officer's possible knowledge of American plans that explains the very large and very complex rescue mission and the urgency to rescue this man and to get him out, and that in order to rescue this navigator, the United States was indeed obliged to carry out an operation using this agricultural airstrip near, well, relatively near to Natanz and Isfahan. And that meant, in effect, using parts of the plan that had been originally developed in order to try to capture this enriched uranium stockpile, and using some of the special forces troops that would have been used in that plan to capture the enriched uranium stockpile. And that, in effect, has compromised the entire plan. It makes it very difficult, or perhaps even impossible, to proceed with it and to execute it further. Well, all of these are very interesting plans, and they're very attractive ones. The only thing I would say is that my understanding is that the stockpile, the enriched uranium stockpile, is buried inside a tunnel. It weighs something like 400 kilos. Some of it is in gaseous form. The force that was deployed to the agricultural airstrip does not seem to me large enough or sufficiently equipped, assuming all this information about this stockpile is true, to remove it. So it seems to me that probably we were seeing some kind of rescue mission carried out, and perhaps Larry Johnson's theory is the best explanation of what took place. But there are other things that one has to say. Firstly, there is some puzzlement as to what the F-15 was doing in the area at all. It's been suggested that the F-15, which is not usually used for deep penetration into hostile airspace, at least not in this way, that it was providing some kind of cover for, or was intended to provide some kind of cover for a larger operation, the bigger operation, maybe to extract the enriched uranium, in which case its shoot down already compromised the entire operation from the start. And of course, there's a lot of other confusion. There's also discussion about how it was that the United States was able to rescue the other pilot. It's been suggested that the photos that have appeared of helicopters, or film actually that's appeared of helicopters with smoke, suggesting that they'd been hit by the Iranians, that film related to the earlier rescue of the other pilot. Well, as we can see, there's a mass of unresolved and unanswered questions. Well, I'm going to just make, again, an observation, repeat the observation that I made in my program yesterday. Firstly, the US government's, Donald Trump's attempt to package this affair as some kind of victory makes absolutely no sense to me. Firstly, we have seen a significant number of valuable US aircraft lost. An F-15, an A-10, damage apparently to another F-15, two expensive, specially adapted C-130 Hercules aircraft used by special forces. Damage apparently done to helicopters, and the Iranians are still insisting that they managed to shoot down two Black Hawks, though they haven't shown us any photos that appear to confirm that. Apparently several drones were also destroyed as well. It's important to say that none of these aircraft had been destroyed before this operation took place. So the destruction of all of these aircraft must be treated as a significant net loss on the part of the United States. Obviously, the United States has many more F-15s, many more drones, many more helicopters. I'm not saying that this is a critical loss. Perhaps these specially adapted C-130s are more difficult to replace. But one way or the other, it does seem to me that even if everyone got in, all the people got in and all the people got out, and the navigator himself was rescued and no one was killed and there were no major injuries or woundings or anything of that kind, still, when one looks at it, clearly this was a net loss by the United States. The ultimate humiliation of having personnel captured by Iran was avoided, but it cannot be denied that in terms of equipment, this was a very expensive operation. A lot of valuable operation was lost, and well, that is a clear loss. And if you like, if you want to use the word defeat, well, you can. And I can understand why the Iranians, for their part, currently are using it. So that then brings us to the bigger question, which is this a precursor of something else? Now, in a live stream that we did with Larry Johnson on Friday, Larry Johnson pointed out that there were numerous indications that the United States, the president and his officials, the War Secretary Pete Hegseth and others, were working up to some kind of big military operation over the course of the Easter holiday. And I wonder whether all of these events that we have seen, difficult though they are to explain, might have indeed been intended to be a part of that big military operation over the Easter holiday. For the moment, it doesn't seem as if such an operation is going to be underway, but perhaps it was attempted and it did in some way fail. Again, it's difficult for me, lacking as I do direct knowledge of military operations, and with the administration and the Pentagon refusing to provide us with more information. It's difficult, it's impossible for me to give a definite assessment or to confirm that something was attempted or was intended over the Easter holiday and that it went wrong and that the result is the situation that we see. But I have to say, it does at least look like that. Whether, as I said, it was intended to seize the stockpile, I have to say I have my doubts about that, or whether there was something else that was intended, I'm not able to discuss. But the resources committed seem to have been excessive for a simple rescue mission. And we still have the unanswered question of why this navigator who got shot down was a lieutenant colonel and not someone of lower rank. By the way, there's other points here which again point to discrepancies. Larry Johnson makes the point that there are claims that the navigator was injured, yet he's supposed to have travelled 5 kilometers despite his injuries and climbed onto an elevation, onto a rocky hill. Well, it might not be impossible. We're probably talking about a very fit and determined man, but certainly it would be a challenging thing to do, especially in hostile territory, just saying. But anyway, we have all of these discrepancies. They all build up, and there's no real explanation for them. Now, all of this cries out for the mainstream media to conduct an investigation. Once upon a time, not so long ago, that is exactly what would have happened. We would have had experienced war reporters who would have noticed all of these anomalies, who would have been asking questions, who would have been asking questions of the Pentagon, asking questions of US officials. They would have eventually given us a much better breakdown and explanation of what took place. There's been absolutely nothing like that. The Daily Telegraph in London, by the way, provided their own account of the operation, which is identical to the official one. And I noticed that they not only did not provide any explanation of, as I said, all of these discrepancies, but the article, which was supposed to be a blow-by-blow account of the whole operation from start to finish, fell far short of that. It was incredibly vague and sketchy, and gave us, in terms of information, very little. Anyway, we're unlikely, it seems to me, at least for the time being, to get a full picture of what really did take place. But again, for the record, my sense is that something was attempted, something was planned. It didn't develop properly. It probably went wrong right from the start. That did require a rescue attempt of the navigator, and whatever it was that was planned had to be aborted. That's my best guess. Now, that might explain that furious, expletive-ridden true social post that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, published yesterday on Easter Day, threatening terrible things upon Iranian officials and upon Iran unless the Strait of Hormuz was opened by Tuesday. Now, in my program yesterday, I speculated that this might have been a Truth Social post published by the President in a state of euphoria after the rescue of the navigator. Having thought about things more, having considered all of the problems with the official account of what took place, I've come to a different conclusion altogether. I think that it was an expression on the part of the President of frustration and rage that an operation that he might have counted on to achieve some dramatic outcome over the Easter weekend miscarried in some way. And I suspect what has added to his frustration is the fact that the Iranians continued to reject the demands that he continues to make upon them. Now, over the last few hours, there's been lots of reports about Pakistan trying to persuade Iran to agree to a 45-day ceasefire, over the course of which more negotiations are supposed to take place. It's not been explicitly said, but it looks as if a part of that ceasefire, that 45-day ceasefire, is an opening during that period of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Iranians have, within the last few hours, shortly before I made this program, made known their strong opposition to this proposal. And this is in the Iranian media. And the title is, Iran says US proposed ceasefire, just a pause before renewed crimes. And we're then told that Iran rejects the US's self-proclaimed proposals for a ceasefire, warning that any pauses resulting from such a ceasefire would only allow adversaries to regroup and commit further crimes against the Iranian nation. At a press conference on Monday, spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry, Esmail Baghei, addressed various proposals, including a 15-point American one, supposedly aimed at ending Washington's February 28th present unprovoked aggression towards the Islamic Republic, which had been conveyed to Tehran via intermediaries. Among other things, the proposal reportedly asks Iran to forego its peaceful nuclear activities, limit its defensive missile program, and reopen the strategic Strait of Hormuz that it has closed to enemies and their allies in retaliation. Iran has categorically rejected the first two proposals. It has also asserted that it would not settle for the enemy's self-described unilateral and unguaranteed ceasefire pledges, stressing that it pursues a conclusive end to any aggression targeting the country. Additionally, the Islamic Republic demands compensation for the extensive damage that the aggressors have inflicted upon the country's various infrastructural facilities. Now, that suggests that what we're looking at here is not a proposal made to Iran by Pakistan and the other mediators, Egypt, Turkey, and the rest, but a proposal to Iran conveyed by the mediators on behalf of the United States, that this is in effect an American proposal. And of course the Iranians are saying this is completely unacceptable. A 45-day ceasefire, an opening of the Strait of Hormuz during that period, with additional demands that Iran stop nuclear enrichment and cease its ballistic missile program. That is not a ceasefire. That is not a compromise. That is a demand for Iran's capitulation. And that is absolutely not something that Iran is obviously prepared to do. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry categorically rejected this proposal. They immediately rejected the proposal outright, and they are saying that they are in the process of preparing a counter proposal which will include demands for reparations from the United States for the damage that has been done to Iran. Now, I can absolutely see how this exchange of messages, and we are talking here about an exchange of messages rather than negotiations, how this exchange of messages combined with whatever happened in Iran itself over the last 72 or so hours, the complex set of events connected to, shall we say, the rescue of the navigator, how all of that might have infuriated the President of the United States, resulting in this expletive-ridden Truth social media post. Now, again, I am going to go into the world of speculation. I don't exactly know, but I wonder whether the President, when he put forward or authorized his representatives to put forward this proposal, this demand, this set of demands for the Iranians to be conveyed to the Iranians via the Pakistani mediators, whether the President assumed that he would be in a stronger position than the one that he is actually in, because he assumed that this complex operation that was being prepared over the Easter holiday, the one which seems to have gone wrong and which resulted in this complex rescue of the navigator, well, he expected that that operation would have achieved some kind of success, would put the United States in a stronger position in some way, that he expected that this military strike, combined with this demand made to the Iranians and conveyed to them by the Pakistani mediators, whether that would have in itself been sufficient to pave the way towards an end of the conflict that the president could package as a victory. It would make sense also, in conjunction with his various other statements and those of his officials, that they expect the conflict with Iran to be over very quickly, within a period of 2 or 3 weeks at most. Some dramatic coup carried out in Iran, followed by, as I said, this demand, the Iranians capitulating, the president is able to declare victory and walk away. Again, to repeat, this is speculation. I am putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and I don't have all the pieces, not by any means. And it may be that I'm getting things badly wrong, but it does seem to me that it is an explanation to consider, and it would explain the president's frustration and rage, and this Truth Social post, which combined this ugly, coarse language and the threats that came with it. Now, I was shocked by that Truth Social media post. I should point out that it is completely contrary to the tradition of American leaders at war. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, all of whom led the United States in war, never publicly spoke like this. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln, towards the end of the war that he led the United States in, spoke about acting with malice towards none, with charity for all. He wasn't threatening death, destruction, and murder upon the other side in the way in which the president has done, nor was he invoking hell in the way that the president has done. The closest approximation I can find or can think of in terms of this sort of behaviour is some of the actions of Lyndon Johnson during the war in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson never went anywhere close as far as this. In Johnson's case, his apparently coarse behaviour lost him considerable support and respect in the United States, and probably played a not inconsequential role in undermining his position, just saying. Anyway, suffice to say that my own shock and frankly disgust at the president's Truth Social post was mirrored by various people in the United States itself. There's been comments made by the president's long-standing opponents in the Democratic Party. Marjorie Taylor Greene has also issued a powerful comment on X, condemning it. Anyway, all I will say is that it is completely untypical of the way in which American leaders leading their country in war have behaved in the past, that it leaves a very bad impression. And it suggests again a president who is under extreme stress and who is losing control of events and is losing control of himself. My own view remains that there is no military resolution to this conflict from the US's point of view. There is no military victory to be gained here. Again, increasingly, I see the word quagmire increasingly used to describe the situation in which the United States is in, or perhaps more accurately, the situation which it faces if it continues with this conflict and tries to win it by conventional means. The Iranians show no sign of giving up. I don't think there is anything realistically that the United States can do that can change that position. Attacking, as the president threatens, Iran's civilian infrastructure, its energy facilities, its industrial plants, though devastating to Iran, are simply going to provoke the Iranians into taking counteraction against the other Gulf producers, with catastrophic effects on the global economy over and above the catastrophic events which we are already seeing. The pathway out of this debacle continues to be through negotiations. Negotiations do not happen via messages, ultimatums passed to Iran through third parties, Pakistan in this case. It means proper negotiations, eventually face-to-face negotiations, and given the complete collapse of trust, complete collapse of confidence on the Iranian side in the goodwill of the United States, inevitably that is going to require mediators who Iran can trust, if only to a certain degree, and who possess some degree of leverage over Iran. Well, one such potential mediator has now again entered the lists, and that is, of course, Russia. The foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, has had a telephone conversation with Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister. The conversation took place yesterday, and the Russian Foreign Ministry has published a readout, and I will read it in full. On April 5th, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had a telephone conversation with Foreign Minister of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Abbas Araghchi, at the latter's initiative. So this tells us that it was the Iranians who initiated the call, and it becomes clear when you read the rest of the Russian readout that the Iranians contacted the Russians to complain about the continued ultimatums from the Americans that they are still receiving. I suspect that the Iranians also wanted to discuss the military operation that has taken place in Iran, the episode relating to the Navigator, which I have discussed so extensively both in this program and in my previous one. Anyway, this is how the Russian readout continues. On behalf of Russia, Sergei Lavrov expressed hope that efforts taken by certain countries to de-escalate tensions around Iran would succeed for the sake of a lasting and sustainable normalization of the situation in the Middle East, whereby the United States, abandoning the language of ultimatums and returning to negotiations would be instrumental. So what Lavrov is saying here is that, yes, the Pakistanis in particular are engaging in a useful role, but the key has to be the United States putting aside the idea that a military solution is possible, abandoning the idea that the Iranians are going to capitulate in the face of American ultimatums. The United States must abandon all that, work towards a lasting and sustainable normalization of the situation in the Middle East, which is to say a long-lasting, effective resolution of the conflict between the United States and Iran, and must do so by returning to genuine negotiations. And then the Russian readout continues. The ministers spoke out against any actions, including within the Security Council, that could undermine the remaining chances for promoting political and diplomatic efforts to settle the crisis. Now, this is a reference to a proposal by the Arab Gulf states for some kind of resolution which would authorize possible military action to open the Strait of Hormuz. The Russians have already made clear that they disagree with this approach. So has China, so has France. To be straightforward, I don't think such a route to reopening the Strait of Hormuz exists. I don't think this can be achieved using conventional means. The Russians made clear their disagreement with this resolution. The talk is that the Gulf states, faced by this opposition from 3 permanent members of the Security Council, all with veto powers, China, Russia, and France, have been watering down the resolution. But it looks as if, as of yesterday, neither the Russians nor the Iranians were satisfied by the extent to which this had been done, and both the Russians and the Iranians continue to oppose the resolution and continue to judge it unhelpful. And then the readout continues. Both sides stress the importance of immediately ceasing the reckless and illegal attacks on civilian, industrial, and energy infrastructure. This is clearly a reference to the previous attacks on Iranian civilian infrastructure, the South Pars gas fields, Iran's industrial facilities, its steel plants, its bridges, and of course the 2 ministers, Arakshi and Lavrov, are also telling Trump, this ultimatum you have issued, using your coarse and unacceptable language to attack Iranian bridges and power stations and all of those things, that is unacceptable as well. And the readout continues, including the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which operates under IAEA safeguards. And of course, the Russians have a particular interest in the Bushehr nuclear power plant because it was they who mostly built it. And then the readout says they also noted that it was unacceptable to create threats to the lives and health of the Bushehr nuclear power plant's workers, who are, of course, in many cases Russians, or risks of a radioactive disaster for the entire region. Sergei Lavrov offered his condolences following the death of the plant's Iranian worker. So the Russians are telling the Americans, resume negotiations, accept mediation, drop your ultimatums, forget about achieving a military solution to this conflict, forget about forcing Iran to capitulate. None of that is going to happen. And put aside once and for all these threats to go after Iran's civilian infrastructure, its gas fields, its oil production facilities, its nuclear power plant at Bushehr, its bridges, its steel mills, all of those things. That is unacceptable, inappropriate escalation. It can lead only to further disaster. And of course, in the case of Bushehr, the Bushehr nuclear power plant, it might also risk a major nuclear accident. Well, that's of course the readout, but the bigger message from this conversation is again that the Russians and the Iranians are in contact with each other at the highest level. The Russians do want to see a permanent resolution of this conflict. The readout says as much. And the Russians, therefore, if asked, will assist in any reasonable, rational process of negotiations intended to achieve a resolution, a successful resolution of this conflict. To repeat again, sending messages to Iran, demanding that Iran accept that which it has already rejected, is not going to change Iranian policy, especially when the Iranians consider themselves to be in a position of advantage through their control of the Strait of Hormuz. Proper negotiations, a real sustained diplomatic effort to bring this conflict to an end and to end it permanently, depends on two things. Firstly, on the United States itself accepting these realities, engaging in serious negotiations, talking to the Russians and probably to the Chinese as well, accepting their mediation, if their mediation is indeed offered, as I believe, working with these other great powers to try to achieve an acceptable resolution of this conflict. That is one. And the second, of course, is to tell the Israelis to stop these constant efforts to create a crisis, to deepen the crisis with Iran, to escalate this war into an effort, if not to achieve regime change in Iran. Apparently even Israeli intelligence now acknowledges that that isn't going to happen, but instead to try to create some kind of physical and political collapse in Iran and implosion. As it happens, I don't think that such a thing is likely or perhaps even possible, but the Israelis still seem to be fixed on the idea that the more Iranian leaders they assassinate, the more likely it becomes that sooner or later, in a week's time, 2 weeks' time, in a month's time, in a year's time, who knows when, that the political system in Iran will collapse. Now, I say all of this. Over the last 24 hours, we've received more reports about another senior Iranian leader being killed. This time it is apparently the chief of Iran's foreign intelligence. Again, it is purely a guess that it is the Israelis who carried out this killing, though I have to say that in the Truth Social post that Donald Trump published yesterday on Easter Day, he also seemed to be talking as if the killing of senior Iranian officials was on the cards if the Iranians did not capitulate to his ultimatum and open the Strait of Hormuz. So one cannot exclude an American involvement. But certainly the idea of assassinating Iranian leaders seems to come from Israel. And it was the Israelis who, on the first day of the conflict, on the 28th of February, carried out the killing of the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and many of his top officials through the missile strike on Khamenei's residence. So it seems to me plausible that it is they who are behind this latest attack again. Anyway, someone in Washington, if a decision is made to try to find an end to this conflict, someone in Washington, someone with power and authority, has to call the Israelis and tell them this has to stop. The United States does have the leverage over Israel to ensure that that happens. There will, of course, be opposition and resistance from Israel's friends in Washington. Senator Graham, Rupert Murdoch, people like that. But if there is going to be a resolution to this crisis, then an eventual resolution to this crisis, then at some point soon, this must be done. Now, the clock on all of this continues to tick. The Iranians have been allowing more ships to pass through the Straits of Hormuz. They allowed another 15 apparently to pass through yesterday. This is a dribble. 90% of merchant shipping that used to pass through the Strait of Hormuz is still unable to do so. Again, the Iranians allowing Iraqi ships or ships carrying Iraqi oil to pass through the Strait of Hormuz is yet again a further demonstration, not that Iran is softening, but that Iran is exercising total control of the Strait of Hormuz. The fact remains that the Strait of Hormuz overall remains shut, and this is creating a deepening crisis in the global economy. I read a report today that the Russians are now calculating that in 2 weeks' time, oil prices will have risen to $150 a barrel. They expect that price will be reached within 2 weeks' time. I read a very troubling article in the British media today by Matthew Lynn, who is, it must be said, very much on the pro-Israeli side of things, or so I understand. Anyway, he, who is a writer mostly about economic matters, is now talking about growing stresses within the so-called shadow banking system. I am not entirely sure what a shadow banking system exactly is, though I understand and have been reading for many years that since the 2008 crisis, the so-called shadow banking system has expanded to monstrous proportions. I suspect that what we're talking about is banks that call themselves something else and operate in the netherworld where there is no regulation and where or minimal regulation, and where they are not required and don't expect a so-called lender of last resort, a central bank, in other words, to step in and rescue them if they get into trouble. And, well, from what I can tell, the business of these so-called shadow banks is to take out risky loans at very high rates of interest, which is obviously very profitable to the people who invest money or who put money in these so-called shadow banks. Well, perhaps it was inevitable, given the way in which the global financial system works, that after the attempts to regulate more stringently the actual classical banking system, a lot of the speculative activity would move into an unregulated so-called shadow banking system. But I don't want to discuss in more detail something that I don't pretend to know very much about or to fully understand. What Matthew Lynn is saying is that there are stresses in the shadow banking system at the present time, and he's also saying that some of these so-called shadow banks are now placing restrictions on the withdrawal of funds from them, from their customers. Now, of course, when actual banks do that, that is a sign that the banks are in crisis. Normally, it is a signal that they're about to collapse. Maybe in the shadow banking world, it is different. I can't see why it would be, but maybe it is. But there is no doubt at all, to my mind, that it shows that the stresses on the global financial system and the global economy, consequent upon the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that these consequences are deepening and getting greater, and the crisis in the global economy is steadily getting worse. So, there is only a limited amount of time. Matthew Lynn makes the point that if there is a collapse in the shadow banking system, that is inevitably going to have major repercussions on the global financial system, and that in turn is in itself likely to lead to a major recession, at least on the scale of 2008. Elsewhere, I read in the Financial Times a further article which said that the major difference between previous energy shocks, like the ones in 1973, in 1979, 1980, and of course the 2022-2023 energy shock. The difference this time is that governments are now so heavily in debt, they have been running deficits, budget deficits, for so long that there is simply inadequate financial firepower at this time for them to step in and take action to mitigate the effect of the energy shock. And of course, if we have a simultaneous energy shock and a crisis in the financial markets, and I don't myself see how it can be otherwise, then we are in very severe economic trouble. Getting some diplomacy going is becoming imperative. The time to do it is running out. Now, there is something else to say as well. The conflict in Ukraine continues. There's been, by the way, further news on the Ukrainian front lines. In summary, the Russians continue to advance practically everywhere, though there is information that in eastern Zaporozhye region, where the Russians recently captured the village of Boykovo near Ternovata, the Ukrainians carried out a counterattack and have recaptured that village. I believe this report, by the way, this report of this Ukrainian counterattack is true because it appears to have been confirmed by the Russian journalist Marat Khairulin, who I consider to set the gold standard of war reporting in this conflict. But elsewhere, in the Zaporozhye region, for example, it appears that the Russians are now in the process of capturing a village called Gulyapolske, not to be confused with the town of Gulyapolye, which of course they captured about 2 or 3 months ago. And of course, the capture of Gulyapolske brings the Russians much closer to the town of Orekhov, with all the indications being that Orekhov is going to be a major focus of the Russian offensive that's coming in the spring, later this spring. Now, I'm not going to discuss the military situation in Ukraine today. This is a topic that always requires time to do. But what I do want to discuss is Ukraine's constant harassment of Russian merchant shipping. There's been the attacks, for example, that I've discussed in many programs by Ukraine on Russia's oil ports in the Baltic and the Arctic. There was a wild claim in Reuters that this had put out of action 40% of Russia's oil export capacity. Well, I said this was definitely wrong, and so it is proved. The oil ports in the Baltic, it is now confirmed, is once again fully back in operation. The Russians are exporting oil through that port again. The problems at this port lasted just a few days, and given that ports are not anyway constantly sending out ships, at least the smaller ones are not constantly sending out ships, it may be the case that there's been no real disruption in exports of oil through this particular port at all. Just saying that it does remain the case that in the middle of a global energy crisis, as countries like India, desperately short of oil, are now queuing up, asking the Russians to sell them more oil, as countries like Japan are trying to find some way to talk to Russia and find some means to get the Russians to supply oil. This harassment campaign that the Ukrainians are conducting is not just unhelpful, permitting it to continue from a US point of view is completely irrational. It should be irrational for the Europeans as well. And, well, the Iranians are not just interfering in Russian shipping in the Baltic. They've also conducted an attack on a container ship, apparently exporting grain through. This was in the Sea of Azov. The Ukrainians obviously have a particular issue about the Sea of Azov because they consider it to be part of their territorial waters. The reality is that the Russians control it and have done so since the capture of the city of Mariupol early on in the war. But anyway, the Ukrainians attacked another bulk cargo vessel carrying grain, again in conditions where there is likely to be a global food crisis. Zelensky and his team have repeatedly shown throughout the entire crisis over Ukraine that they are single-mindedly concerned with their own interests, or at least, to be more precise, what they define as Ukraine's interests, and that they show absolutely no interest in or concern for the interests, even of those countries that support them. We can see this in the way that Zelensky constantly demands that the West impose more and more sanctions on Russia, that it supplies Ukraine with more and more weapons, regardless of the size of Western arsenals, that it gives Ukraine unlimited funding, regardless of budget problems in Western countries, that there is an almost unending succession of ever more extreme demands from the Ukrainians. Now, again, the point has to come now, especially at a time of extreme global economic stress, but also where the Russians may be the only people who have the key to resolving this crisis. The point now has to come when Zelensky and the Ukrainians are told to stop, that this kind of activity must end, that if Ukraine continues with it, then it's not just going to be a case of the West no longer supplying Ukraine with more weapons. the West has no weapons to give Ukraine. It's not just going to be a case of the West stopping money flows to Ukraine. It's going to be a case of the West, or at least if not the West, because the Europeans in this are probably a hopeless case, but anyway, the Americans lifting sanctions. I think they should be doing that anyway. But the Americans lifting sanctions, fully normalizing their relations with Russia, and ending further intelligence assistance to Ukraine, and perhaps even providing the Russians with information about the various activities that the Ukrainians have been conducting against Russia with American intelligence support. Now, that I know seems like an extreme demand, or at least an extreme threat. Many of you watching this video will say that there is absolutely no way that the Americans could ever do such a thing. But the reality is that the Ukrainians have been taking advantage to an extreme degree of whatever assistance that the United States has provided. Ukraine has shown no interest in any diplomatic proposals, grossly inadequate as they are, that the United States has been providing. And in the US's own interests, given that it's almost certainly going to need Russia's help to get out of this mess that the United States is now in with Iran, the US has to tell Ukraine and Ukraine's more obsessive European allies that this has got to stop. Just as it's overdue for the United States to have a full and frank discussion with its Israeli allies and tell the Israelis that enough is enough. Killing of Iranian officials and the perpetuation of this feud with Iran has been, for the United States and the world, globally, colossally counterproductive. So that same conversation with the Ukrainians is, and indeed the Europeans, is also now massively overdue. I understand that there will be opponents of this in the United States, but always in the world of politics, of diplomacy, choices have to be made, difficult decisions have got to be made. We have now reached that point where it is no longer viable for the United States to continue with both of these wars in the way that it is doing, allowing its proxies to run amok in the way that they have done. Now, will that happen? Well, of course, in the short term, it won't. I cannot imagine at this moment, given the state of mind that the president is in, judging at least from his social media posts, that he's going to give that kind of warning to his Israeli friends or even to the Ukrainian allies of the United States, who he so visibly despises. For one thing, I still think that he's not prepared to go against the incessant, obsessive demands within the United States are some of Donald Trump's newly found allies, people like Lindsey Graham and Rupert Murdoch. But at some point, over the next few weeks, over the next few months, these conversations have to happen. The alternative is, of course, a global economic crisis, a prolongation of the war with Iran, an eventual defeat in Ukraine. That has been obvious for a long time, ever since the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, which the Russians defeated so comprehensively. And of course, potentially, a defeat in the Middle East by Iran, which would be the biggest geopolitical catastrophe suffered by the United States since the end of the Second World War. One can deny reality up to a certain point. And if you are the United States, well, you can deny it for a very long time. But in the end, reality has to be faced. And that is the situation the United States is in now. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X, and Substack. Please remember that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop.